Okay, let's talk about setting your basic stitches. So, at the very least, you'll want a machine that has a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. And every machine will have a different way of adjusting these settings. Mechanical machines will usually have knobs like this, and computerized machines will have buttons for different settings. So you'll have to see your owner's manual for how you do yours, but you're going to want to know about the basic straight stitch. So the straight stitch is a basic utility stitch that'll be used for most construction. It's best for sewing seams unless you need like a stretchier stitch, like for a knit. But for the most part, you're going to be using a straight stitch. When sewing with a straight stitch, the most common adjustment will be adjusting the stitch length, and that can eliminate puckered seam and just create a nice even seam and stitch. So the typical range is 0 to 4 millimeters, but you can go up to 5 or 6 for like a basting. But the average stitch length is probably about a 2.5. So 2.5 millimeter is the typical setting for new sewing machines. And then the smaller the stitch length number, the smaller the stitch. So if you want to reinforce a seam, or you're sewing sheer fabric or need stronger stitches, you're going to want a smaller length. Now, a longer stitch length is typically used for basting or temporary stitches. And sometimes when doing a top stitch, you'll have a slightly longer stitch length, so it just stands out more and you can see it as a top stitch. The next common stitch is a zigzag stitch. You always want to make sure that you have a zigzag or universal presser foot on when you're using a zigzag stitch, otherwise you'll break your needle, because as the needle goes back and forth, it will hit your presser foot. So keep that in mind when doing a zigzag stitch. But the most common use for a zigzag stitch are for like a stretchy stitch for working on like knit fabric, or as a seam finish to a raw edge. Okay, and you can adjust the stitch length and width to change the appearance of a zigzag stitch. And I'll show you that here in a minute. And then the last thing you need to learn about is the stitch length. So like I said earlier, the smaller the number, the smaller the stitch. The larger the number, the longer the stitch. And 2.5 to 3 millimeters is most common for basic stitch length. Okay, so I want you to find on your machine where your knobs or buttons are to adjust the stitch setting, to find the straight stitch and the zigzag stitch, and to adjust the stitch length. Now I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to show you how I do that and what it looks like when I adjust those, and then I want you to go to your machine and you're going to look for those and adjust it on your machine. Okay? Let's go over there. Okay, now we're going to look at adjusting your stitches. The two most common stitches that you are going to use are a basic straight stitch, which is just like a basic utility stitch, and it will likely look like one of these symbols on your machine. Okay, just a plain straight stitch. Now, this one shows a stitch going through the middle, and that's what I use the most, but you can also choose one that goes off to the side, and if you watch when I press that button, you'll see my needle moves off to the side. Okay, I usually just keep my needle in the middle for a straight stitch. So there's straight stitch, and then with the straight stitch you can adjust the stitch length. Now my machine is electronic, so it has buttons, but you might have a knob. So you might have a knob that says 3, 4, 5, 6 for your stitch length. Okay, so the higher the number, the longer your stitch length is going to be. Smaller number, the shorter. So on my machine, I'm in the straight stitch, and my particular machine tells me to use my universal or straight stitch foot, which is the foot I have on. Then right here, it's telling me that this is going to adjust the length. So on my machine, the most common stitch length is 2.5. So if I stitch a 2.5, you'll see it's a small stitch, and I'll show you this after. Now if I go up on my stitch length to a 3 or 3.5, it's going to make a longer stitch. And if I go all the way up to like a 5, that would be what's called a basting stitch. It's a really long stitch and it's easier to remove. So let me show you what that looks like. So if you can see, these first stitches were just about 2.5. Then I went up to around a 3 to 3.5, and then down here is a really long number 5 basting stitch. So you can see the smaller the number, the shorter the stitch, and as you get a bigger number, the longer the stitch. That's on a basic stitch. Now if you go to zigzag stitch, you will also either probably have a knob or another button, and it will show a symbol like this. This is a zigzag stitch, and you will use this to finish seams or to work on stretch fabric. So if I do a zigzag stitch, you have to make sure that you have a zigzag foot. And a zigzag foot or universal foot has a wider opening right here. Sometimes a stretch foot, a straight stitch foot will just have a little hole, like just a tiny little hole, because all the needle needs to do is go up and down. But with a zigzag stitch, you've got to have room for the needle to go back and forth. So make sure you have either a zigzag foot or a universal foot on your machine. Okay, then you go back to your settings, and if we're just doing a regular zigzag stitch, the length will be at a 2, 2.5, and you'll see a zigzag stitch goes back and forth. Now, I can make the length higher or lower. On my machine, I can take it lower, it starts higher, but it makes the stitches really close together. And if I make the stitch length higher, it spreads them apart, and I'll show you again when I'm done here. Now you can also adjust the width of a zigzag stitch. Mine is pretty high, but I'll make it a little higher. So the width is how fat the zigzag is going to go. So I'll make a few where it's really wide, and then I'll take it down, do a little bit smaller, and take it as small as it'll go. Now you can see this is a zigzag stitch, and when I had the length longer, you can see it's separated out. The length was, I had a high number for the length, so it's separated out. When I made that shorter, it really scrunched those zigzag stitches up. Okay, then when you adjust the width, if I start with a wider width, you see this zigzag is fatter and wider, and as you go smaller, it goes smaller and smaller until you get a narrower zigzag stitch. So when you adjust the length of a zigzag stitch, it's going to open it up, make it longer or shorter and more smushed together. And when you adjust the width, it's going to make it either fatter or more narrow and skinny. So those are the settings that you need to know for stitch length and stitch width. Again, if you have an electronic machine, it will be in button form. And if you have a manual machine, you're going to have dials that you adjust to change the stitch setting and the length and width.